Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. You can also subscribe to our RSS feed with details on our site. Please follow us on Twitter, we're podcast_init, or you can find us on Google+, where we're at plus.google.com/pluspodcastinit, the Python podcast, with dashes in between. Please give us feedback. You can leave a review on iTunes, send us a tweet, send us an email, or leave us a message on Google+. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. And there's a new Python podcast that just started up recently. It's called the Python Test Podcast and covers the world of testing in Python, so go ahead and give it a listen. You can find it at pythontesting.net. We're recording today on August 18th, 2015, and your hosts as usual are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. Today we are interviewing Bryan Van de Ven about the Bokeh project. Bryan, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, so my name's Bryan Van de Ven. I work for Continuum Analytics down here in Austin, Texas for just about 3.5 years. I'm right now the project lead directing the Bokeh visualization project, but I've also done quite a bit of training and teaching for Continuum as well. We do a lot of professional services and training, and so I've had a good time doing that. And in the past, I've worked with Python in a bunch of different contexts, so I'm excited to talk with you guys today.
That's great. It seems like Austin is the hip happenings place for startups and companies to be these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a lot of startup activity here. We have, a new WeWork office for CoSpaces, and it's packed to the gills pretty much constantly. General assemblies here, teaching classes for people to get into coding all over the place. There's pretty much meetups any given night of the week. There's just no shortage of sort of tech happenings in Austin. Certainly there's a lot of startups here as well, going back to Austin Ventures and now new sort of funding initiatives as well. So you're right. It's absolutely a great place to be for working in tech, and I love it.
So how did you get introduced to Python?
That's a great question. So I've actually been using Python sort of on and off. I have sort of an on and off history with Python, but it goes back really a long time. I actually had to think about it. I think the first time I used Python was just about another lifetime ago. I was a sysadmin at a Motorola wafer fab here in Austin in 1997. So I think it was Python 1.4. And so at the time, really was just doing some basic shell scripting and web scripting. I think we were using mod Python with Apache, and it was interestingly enough, my first sort of exposure to graphics and plotting on the web was back then too. There was some package, I have no idea what it was at the time, or what it was now rather, but it used PIL, I think, to generate images, bar charts and pie charts, just very simple static images that it could display on your website based on some data. And so I thought that was really neat. And so that sort of goes back a long time. But that was my first exposure to Python, and then I used it in various other places as well. I used it at a research lab I worked at, working on sonar systems. I've worked, on other plotting systems as well. And then, of course, here at Continuum, we're a big investment in Python, of course.
So for our listeners who aren't familiar with what Bokeh is, can you describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bokeh is a library for creating interactive visualizations that maybe have novel types of graphics, or that can handle streaming or large data sets, or that can have widgets and interactions and all of these sorts of things together, that you can have these sorts of interactive visualizations in the browser, sort of as a first-class concern. It's 2015. That's the right target to be in, I think, is in the browser, but without having to write really JavaScript, right? So we're, like I said, as I mentioned, a big Python shop. So we've invested heavily in what I'll call Python bindings for Bokeh, but the architecture of Bokeh is actually such that you can create bindings for it in a lot of languages. And so other people have come along and created bindings for Bokeh in R and Scala and Lua. And, it's just an exciting time. I'd love to see bindings for Bokeh anywhere and everywhere. But, the main idea is to enable people to create these visualizations that can handle all kinds of interesting things with a minimum of code, but a lot of expressivity and a lot of power.
So what inspired you to create Bokeh?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, credit where credit is due. So the initial, vision of Bokeh really, I think, goes down to one of the co-founders of Continuum, Peter Wang. He's a friend of mine for a long time. We worked together previously at a different job, and he had been working on a library called Chaco for interactive visualizations, a rich client environment. And so we worked together on that. I think I added some features like image plots and contour plots and some widgets. And the focus there was really interactivity. And so Bokeh is sort of an evolution, I think, of both of our ideas about that. Obviously, again, making the web and the browser a first-class concern because it is 2015, but also just being able to handle newer sort of challenges, again, sort of larger data sets that you might want to put into into a client or streaming data sets and all of those things. And the other side of that coin is, of course, that it's not solely my creation, right? I mean, I'm very privileged to work with just an amazing team of people. I mean, Bokeh has grown into a quite large project, and I'm very grateful to be able to work with everyone on this team and to be able to work with so many talented people who are contributing in all kinds of different ways. I wouldn't be able to do all this together. We have people who are working on, build automation. Damien Avila is a core IPython committer. He gave a talk at SciPy recently. There was a talk right before him about build automation and how a project reduced their release cycle to sort of a matter of months. And, they got their releases down to a few days. And he gave a talk and he showed off the automation he'd done for Bokeh, and he actually, fired off a release, did a git tag and released a dev build during the talk, and it was done at the end. And so, things like that. I worked with really just amazing people who really make Bokeh possible. But the reason we want to do it ultimately is to be able to connect people, to allow them to connect to data, and to be able to do that in a very easy way. We want to build a bridge so we can let data scientists, data experts, domain experts really get to their data and get a look into their data with sort of a minimum of hassle and fuss. And again, sort of not having to write JavaScript is a big part of lowering that barrier.
Yeah, I know that D3 is a really popular library for visualization, and pretty much every time I've heard someone speak about it, it's generally in the context of trying to figure out how it actually works so that they can actually use it effectively. So it's definitely nice to have projects like Bokeh around to make it easier to produce data visualizations. I know that there's a project called Vincent for being able to use Python to generate D3 visualizations that goes through a couple of transpilation steps before it gets up to the browser. So having a tighter integration with Python is definitely a good advantage for the Bokeh project. And it's great to hear that it's got such a large and supportive community, and it's always nice to have a company behind it to make sure that core maintainers don't get totally burned out on trying to work on the project in their free time, because that's definitely something that has been an issue in open source for a long time and has been getting increasing visibility with a lot of people sort of quitting open source as a result of getting burned out from having too many people place demands on them.
For sure. It's a big consideration. I consider myself very lucky to be in the position to be able to work on an open source project that I am really invested in and I really, am interested in and believe in. And I'm very grateful that, Continuum, I think we've managed to do a great job of aligning, the incentives correctly such that we can develop, really cutting edge open source tools, but also make them, monetizable so we can keep the lights on, right? As sort of a going concern. Mm-hmm. But I'm definitely happy to be in that position and grateful to be in that position, and hopefully we'll keep moving it forward. You mentioned things like Vincent and Vega and integration from Python. That's definitely a lot of people are interested in that space. We're certainly not the only player in that space, and so there's a lot of activity, and it's really exciting to see what other people are doing. There's a bunch of different projects, and certainly we're happy to integrate with all kinds of things as well. So we work on things like matplotlib integrations and ggplot.py and Seaborn integrations as well, all sorts of things. So I think the more the merrier. It's my own personal thinking on all of that.
Leading off of your mention of the integration with those other plotting libraries, I can see how those would be useful for easily updating the existing code that you might have using those libraries to be able to publish the visualizations on the web easily. And are there other use cases for those integrations? And also, does the Bokeh integration add interactivity to the plots, or does it just provide a way to publish PNG, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the idea is that you take your matplotlib code, and, we all have a lot of matplotlib code. I have a lot of matplotlib code that we all have laying around, and we want to be able to now be able to put up a plot on the web that maybe has interactive tools just out of the box. And so that's absolutely what you get. Is a tool that has, panning and zooming and selections, and you can, treat it just like a Bokeh plot once you sort of make a single function call on it to make it a Bokeh plot, and now you can add more tools to it or more interactions as well, or embed it in larger documents. And so I think there's a lot of use cases there. One, again, is people have code. There's a lot of existing code that makes use of it. I'll say right now that our matplotlib compatibility is not complete yet. I'm really excited. The matplotlib team is actually working on their own JSON serialization scheme, basically for sort of ingest and serialization of matplotlib plots, and that'll allow a lot of different projects like Bokeh or MPLD3 or Plotly, all of us to integrate better with matplotlib, and so that opens the doors again to things like ggplot.py and Seaborn, actually Pandas, of course, plotting. So there's just NetworkX too as well. So there's just a lot of different doors that opens, and so I'm interested in pushing that as far as we can.
Yeah, definitely. Because data visualization or visualization in general is, as we've said, a growing space, and it's not confined to the realm of data science where it is sort of gets the most visibility and discussion, because there are, any number of other areas where having a interactive chart can provide a lot of extra context to something that you're looking at. One of the more popular areas is, for instance, gathering system metrics for monitoring purposes. And I know that there are a number of dashboards that use D3 for that purpose. And so having something like Bokeh where you can manage the visualization on the server side, I can see it making it easier to produce even more tools that have functionality that we haven't even dreamed of yet.
It's amazing what users think of. I mean, I'm really familiar with, sort of deep in the weeds most of the time and thinking about the code. And at heart, I'm a tinkerer, right? I'm a tool maker. I'm not actually a data scientist myself, and I'm not the question guy, right? But everyone else out there has these amazing questions that they're trying to answer, and so I've never ceased to be amazed at that. I was at a PyData conference, I think, in Berlin last year, and someone came up to me and they had this idea for using Bokeh to create basically like a mechanical Turk system. So you could hover, some user could hover over a system and get an image in like a hover tooltip. And I hadn't thought about putting images in hover tooltips at all, but this is the sort of thing that, when you start to get users, they have ideas and really great ideas, and it sort of pushes the project forward. They have bug requests too, don't get me wrong. Sometimes I look at the GitHub tracker and I feel like I'm just a disappointment factory because, the list of issues goes up so fast. But no, users have really tremendous ideas. So there's that. I just recently did a sprint at another PyData conference. It was PyData Seattle, and an astronomer postdoc came, and he'd been working on this really cool galaxy data. And again, he was doing cool stuff with hover tooltips, and he wanted to have all these interactions using the new sort of JS callbacks that we just added. And it's just exciting to see, when people come with real problems, real interesting problems, and what they try to do with Bokeh, things that I hadn't necessarily thought of at all.
I just want to quickly address an earlier point that you made with regards to Matplotlib extending their interface to allow all these other tools to take better advantage of it. That's one thing that has really struck me. I won't be able to say this for much longer, but I still consider myself to be somewhat of a Python noob. And, I've had a lot of years working with Ruby and some other open source communities. And I realize there's some cross-pollination and some sort of, coordination work, in pretty much all of them. But it really strikes me how deep this goes in the Python community. It seems like the Python universe is populated by projects that seem intensely interested in working with each other and leveraging each other's strengths and building bridges to each other wherever possible. And that just seems amazing to me.
I definitely think that's true. I mean, I think that is sort of the core ethos of the Python sort of community going back a long way. I mentioned, I started using Python in the late 90s, and at the time, that's when people like Dave Beasley were creating Swig, the wrapper generator, so you could call, Fortran and C and C++ code from Python. Really want to be able to sort of make Python this amazing glue language and extend its reach into scientific computing by being able to do that. And then, people like Jim Huguenin and Travis Oliphant come along and make, NumPy and start the beginning of sort of the, the scientific stack in Python. With NumArray and NumPy, and then Pandas comes along, Wes McKinney, and it just grows and builds steam. We have all of this huge interdependent scientific stack in Python, which is truly enormous. And just in the last few years, it's just exploded, and it's been really gratifying to see. And again, it's really great to see all of these projects work together. And so I agree with that 100%. I think it's a fantastic community, and it's good to see all the people every year at SciPy and PyData conferences and at PyCon when I can go and see what people are up to.
Yeah, there's a definite lack of ego in the community at large, where it definitely leads to a much more welcoming and collaborative environment. So you mentioned earlier that Bokeh has bindings for languages other than Python. I know that R and Julia are some pretty obvious candidates due to their strong focus on analytics work. And I'm curious what made Scala and Lua candidates for creating bindings above any other language that you might have targeted.
Well, so we didn't target those, right? So that's sort of the beauty of those is that, the architecture of Bokeh is such that, and it's just, I would say this is somewhat novel. Other people sort of reached the same place, I think, around the same time that we did. Instead of sending scripts, actual scripts to the client to render a bar chart or a pie chart or a, whatever scatter plot, we actually create a, sort of declarative scene graph, right? An object model of what we want to render, and we ship that over as a pile of JSON. To the client. And then the client is almost like a compiler or an interpreter that takes this big pile of JSON, reconstitutes this object model and renders the scene with the tools and all of the visual guides and whatever you want to see. But the takeaway from that, of course, is that any language that can generate the right pile of JSON can drive Bokeh plots, Bokeh.js plots in the client. And so other people have come along. So our Bokeh was created by Ryan Hafen, who's one of our ex-data collaborators. The Julia bindings were Samuel Colvin, who's one of the main Julia guys. The Scala bindings was created by a Continuum dev, but that's because he's a big Scala fan. Honestly, I think he's he's really into strong typing. I think he's a bigger Scala fan, maybe secretly than Python even. But that was initially his initiative, and obviously we realized that's actually really cool. And there is use of Scala, for instance, finances. So we definitely now encourage the continued development of Bokeh.Scala, particularly because a lot of our some of our services work may intersect with that. But initially we didn't think about that to push it explicitly. The Lua thing happened actually. Facebook released a series of IPython notebooks, or Jupyter notebooks now, for their iTorch machine learning libraries, and that's in Lua. And so they wrote a very sort of primitive Bokeh binder. They didn't even come to us to talk about it. They just sort of announced it on Twitter, and we took a look and we're like, whoa, there's Bokeh in here. How did that happen? And so that's actually really fantastic, is that, I want to get to the point where Bokeh becomes a platform where people can contribute to it without, really needing to involve us, right? And it can grow sort of in an organic way and in whatever direction people want to take it.
Is the correct pronunciation bouquet, as in of flowers, or bokeh, or how does one pronounce this appropriately?
I've heard a few different pronunciations, and I think there's kind of a range that's acceptable. I say bokeh, but I've heard bokeh and bouquet, and the only one that I heard that I know was wrong for sure was there was someone just reading off sort of the names of the different projects that were involved, and at one point they said and also this visualization database Bokeh. So that I know that's wrong. Apart from that, I think it's pretty fair game and pretty lenient on the pronunciations that'll work.
Yeah, I do know that the name comes from a style of Japanese photography.
Yeah, so there's a really technical meaning having to do with sort of the shape of the aperture, and you get these sort of hexagonal flares, and then there's sort of a more artistic meaning concerning sort of the depth of field and pulling different things in and out of focus. And so that was sort of the idea we were trying to capture, is that we wanted to create a tool that maybe you have a lot of data, and the best way to sort of view it is to try to pick what is actually important about that. And we wanted to give people tools to sort of pick out, amongst maybe a larger set of data, what's the really important piece, and draw the focus to that.
Bringing this on a little further, you mentioned the ability to sort of change the focus of the data as it's being rendered in the visualization. And I know that one of the things that Bokeh supports is downsampling of the data. And I'm just curious what the mechanism behind that might be, if you can describe some of the underpinnings.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of different ways to get to that. Actually, I mean, that's sort of one of the nice things about Bokeh, is there's a lot of flexibility. I would say some of that's built in and some of that's an evolving sort of work in progress. So in general, one way to interact with Bokeh is to create documents that have we call them AJAX data sources. They're basically data sources that can pull data into the client directly. And so if you have a REST API that can provide you data at whatever resolution you sort of can ask for, you can use this AJAX data source to get whatever downsampled data you want. So that could be an existing REST API that you have, or maybe you write a little server that does that kind of downsampling. I showed off a recent demo at SciPy, actually, sort of Ocean data. It was a 5 gig data cube, I think, and it was over the network. Even conference Wi-Fi still worked. It just hit this REST API with sort of the screen dimensions and the data dimensions, and then the server did a downsampling that was appropriate for those dimensions and returned an image that was shown. And so we could sort of zoom in and out and pan and to get progressive refinement as we went. And so that's sort of one way. There's other things that we do want to support more directly, sort of alongside Bokeh. I will say, I think originally we had a conception that some of these features should be part of Bokeh. We're sort of moving to a server architecture that's a little bit more simpler, such that it's more of a platform and allows people to, again, develop a lot of things without necessarily having to involve us. And so some of those things would be like these interactive sort of intelligent downsampling ideas. But the main thing is that the server is a place where something interesting happens. So the way Bokeh is architected is such that if you push this model, this object graph to the server, it gets mirrored into the client. So we have these set of Python models in the server, they get mirrored into backbone models in the client, and there's a two-way communication that's set up so that if you change something on the server, the client updates. If you change something on the client, on the browser, the server updates. And so that gives you a chance to have callbacks and do inform further computations, or to do whatever you want, things like downsampling. It's a place where interesting things can happen, I guess, is maybe the way of putting it. And so we have some interesting ideas. We have some academic collaborators, Joseph Cottam and Jim Bednar, some people who've been working on these ideas that we call data shading. We used to call them abstract rendering. We're sort of calling them data shading now. If you're familiar with sort of HDR photography, sort of the idea of extending your dynamic range by looking at the distribution of colors and of sort of the data in front of you and changing maybe like an alpha overcompositing based on that distribution in a smart way. That's the kind of thing we want to do. And so some of those things I would say are still very sort of early days, and we have some demonstrations of capability, but I think we'll have a lot more progress on those in the next coming months and towards the end of this year. But the main idea is that the server is just a place where any of these kind of interesting things can happen. You could actually imagine even further sort of interesting things, like here with the downsampling, you might imagine, because you can communicate things like just the data bounds, but also the screen pixel density or screen resolution to the server could decide at some point, hey, the data density and the pixel density are commensurate. I'm actually not going to do this downsampling anymore. I'm just going to show the real data. Or at least maybe it might decide to start showing things like outliers on top of the downsampled data in a sort of intelligent way. So it's just a place where additional decisions can be made in hopefully an intelligent way to update the plot and aid the visualization of your data.
Yeah, I can definitely see how just that right there would provide a huge advantage over something like D3 because of the fact that it's already built into the architecture of the project, whereas in D3 you would have to create all of that extra framework around it to be able to get something approaching what Bokeh can do.
Well, so don't get me wrong, D3 is a fantastic tool. I mean, I think the best description I've heard of it as it's sort of artisanal tool. As you mentioned, if you want to make an amazing, just incredible visualization, you can probably do certainly things that you can't do with Bokeh, or certainly not easily with Bokeh. But Bokeh, again, you write a lot of JavaScript to do that. And we're trying to reach people who may not be familiar with JavaScript, who may not be familiar with web deployments, who may not be familiar with all these JS libraries or CSS even. And so we want to reach people to create a fairly high level of sophistication in their visualizations, but without necessarily having to write JavaScript. And that's the main target and the sweet spot that we're trying to find. So, I think we sacrifice a little bit of flexibility for that is a fair assessment, but hopefully we gain in audience as well.
So this leads into another question that I had. Do you lose any capabilities using the JavaScript library by itself without the Python bindings?
No, quite the contrary. I mean, the JavaScript library almost, I would treat it as sort of a VM or a compiler. It's strictly the superset of any binding that you could create. I mean, anything that you can do, you can only do because you can do it with Bokeh.js. And so I will say that one thing, that the Bokeh.js library lacks right now is sort of a good functional API. So, if you create the right pile of JSON, Bokeh.js will render everything and you'll get a great plot. But now putting that JSON together is kind of a pain to do by hand. And so that's, again, a large part of the Python binding is to create higher level APIs that can create this serialized object graph for you in correct ways. But on the JavaScript side, there's sort of a minimal API that can help do that. But I would love to get new contributors that are much more familiar. So I'm actually not a very experienced JavaScript dev. Fortunate to have a few new people coming on that are more experienced JavaScript devs. I sort of stumbled through writing a lot of Bokeh.js on the strength of my previous experience writing similar plotting libraries. And so for that reason, I think Bokeh.js it looks a little bit different than a lot of JavaScript libraries. But I would love to get a real bona fide API for Bokeh.js that JavaScript devs would use sort of as a first class thing. And so, it has things like really nice integrations with React or Angular, jQuery, all of these things. And so if anyone's interested in that, definitely, come contact us. I would love to talk about what a way forward on that would be, because right now you can certainly use Bokeh.js, but it's a little bit hard to use Bokeh.js.
And taking that in the other direction, is there any utility in using the Python bindings with something other than the JavaScript library of Bokeh? And as a corollary to that, do you think that it would make sense to even attempt to create any sort of standardized data format for describing visualization? Perhaps something based off of the grammar of graphics?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So, I mean, there are I think overtures in that directions are already. So, one of the things is if, whenever the matplotlib sort of JSON serialization comes in, we'll have a means to convert the Python, Bokeh object model into sort of matplotlib format and get out matplotlib graphs. People have also asked us for static images, and this is one area where sort of Bokeh has actually had a difficult time. It's sort of a thorny technical problem to get images out of the browser, and that's just for PNGs. People really want SVGs, and so Canvas is raster-based, and so that's even harder. And so one of the ideas we've batted around is to create actually basically just a second backend for Bokeh that might be some Cairo-based backend or something like that could just ingest a subset of, the Bokeh.js JSON format enough to render static images as SVGs, and then it would be able to do that. So definitely, I think there's utility in that. In terms of having a centralized grammar, that's definitely a very attractive idea. I mean, the problem there is that's a people problem, right? I mean, that's a matter of getting coordinations. Everyone's got their idea about what is important to them, and different projects have different focuses. And so, in principle, that's, I guess, an amazing idea. In terms of actually making it happen, I think it's a very difficult prospect, but maybe someday we'll get there. We do certainly have some things like that. There's the sort of the Vega standard is out there. And actually, we're working to hopefully have Bokeh integrate with Vega, be able to ingest Vega at some point. Then we can get some nice, there's a really nice sort of cross-filter tool called Polaris, which emits Vega, right? And so we could use that. If we get our Vega sort of bindings or Vega ingest working, we can sort of have nice front ends, this really nice slick JS, cross-filter front ends like Polaris drive, Bokeh plots. And so that would be really cool as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Will there someday be a JSON format to rule them all? Maybe. I don't know. I won't speculate.
Certainly.
It's funny, actually, that you came around to a more native rendering solution, because one of the things that I was kind of musing about as I was thinking about tonight's interview was, I wonder if they've ever thought of hooking this up to something like Kivy, and doing like a native rendering as opposed to a web rendering, and getting some of that amazing real-time visualization goodness in a platform that can sort of, even perhaps more in an even richer way than JavaScript and the web canvas can render some really nifty visualizations.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a possibility for doing that, and I may have to even look at Kivy. I take an initial stab looking at the Cairo, and Cairo was more difficult to build than I remember on OS X especially, and so I sort of put that effort down. But I'll make some binary packages for me to install maybe, and make my life easier. But it's interesting that you mentioned performance, though. I'll say coming into Bokeh, when I first started working, about 2 years ago in earnest on the Bokeh project, I had done previous experience on a C++ library. So I worked on Chaco a long time ago with Peter Wang. That's sort of how we both got into this. But after that, I worked on a C++ library at this research lab that I worked on, and I sort of built it with some of the ideas of Chaco in mind. Sort of making sort of interactive tools a first-class concern, and at the time it used sort of Cairo as a rendering backend, and it was, I felt it was okay, but it was occasionally, laggy or not so performant, and so I came into Bokeh with this perception and this expectation that it was just, this is never going to work, right? I mean, how is it possibly going to be efficient enough? I mean, it's not even the C++ Cairo library, which is surely got to be fast, right? But the JS engines in all the modern browsers and the Canvas implementations are truly astounding, and I've never ceased to be amazed at just what can be done on the regular HTML canvas. And we're actually in the process of adding WebGL support as well. Some of that's going to land in our 0.10 release in September. We have Almar Klein, some VizPy. VizPy has done some work to work on WebGL for us. So now we can extend our range sort of even further. If you really do want to ship 100K points into a Bokeh plot, you can do that, and that'll be great. But it's just incredible to me that that's possible in the browser. I mean, I guess one day we really are going to have sort of browser OSs, and that's going to be our ultimate VM that everyone targets, and we're just going to compile everything to JavaScript. It's kind of it's a crazy heady world that we live in these days.
At Wood's Law, anything that can be written in JavaScript will eventually be written in JavaScript.
Right.
Talking about WebGL support, it made me think, so is the next step fly through Bokeh visualizations,
Yeah, so the initial stab of the WebGL is really about, so the first step is just to get any integration with WebGL, and it really just to make our existing 2D visualizations give them further reach into sort of larger data sets than you'd be able to do now. But eventually there are a couple of kinds of like 3D plots that I think are interesting and useful and people have asked for. And so, I don't think that we're going to retool the entire sort of pipeline or architecture of Bokeh to be able to handle sort of, generic 3D visualization. Like we're not going to write VTK, in right. JavaScript. I'm not going to do that. But, I think we might have some canned, like sort of schematic 3D plots. Well, I got a 3D scatter plot or 3D surface plots or ribbon plots. And so we'll have like a limited selection of 3D plots that you can sort of include in a Bokeh visualization in a fairly prescribed way is what I would imagine that leading to, later this year or early next year.
I think that's very smart, and it kind of goes back to your previous point when you talked about losing some flexibility the way you had designed, I believe it was the Bokeh JavaScript side. I think there's a lot to be said for making the simple case simple, and it's okay if you give up a little bit of flexibility for that, because the people who want total control are probably building their own visualization rendering system on JavaScript anyway, and so it's a good thing to make to allow the 90% of your users to get the job done quickly, efficiently, and be really surprised by how easy it is. I think that's definitely, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's mirrored in the approach we've taken. I mean, I will say there are a lot of knobs and switches and dials you can turn at the lowest level of Bokeh, and you can really configure just a ton of things. But the lowest level at Bokeh is really, again, these objects, we call them models. There's a model for, a plot and axes and grids and, all the different tools and all the different glyphs you can throw up on a plot. And so you can control all the visual aspects of that and attach those to data, give them single values or attach them to columns of data, however you want. There's a lot of flexibility, but again, putting this object graph together by hand at that level is kind of a pain. And so we have a very layered approach to our API, where we have sort of a bokeh.plotting API that gives you a basic single plot, that you can throw glyphs at very easily, and it has sort of standard set of tools you can add more or less, but it's very easy to get up and running. And then a higher level, even, we're still working, and this is maybe the newest and most work in progress level, is bokeh.charts, where we have sort of statistical, canned statistical charts, sort of schematic charts that are very common. That might involve some data transformation as well as part of the process, but it lets you get a lot done with very little code. And so we're trying to really provide a range of options for people, so that if you really need access to those lower level bits, you can certainly get to them and tweak whatever you want. But if you don't need that, then you have a very high level or higher level options to address those those kind of visualizations.
Other than the sample data sets that come with Bokeh, can you suggest a good publicly available data set with accompanying tutorial for people who want to get started with data visualization using Bokeh?
Yeah, I wish I had some really good suggestions. This goes back to what I mentioned before, is I'm really a tinker. I'm a sort of a craftsman. I like making things, and I'm not a data scientist. I mean, it'll sound corny, but it even goes back to my elementary school days. I was petrified of science fair time of the year because I could never think of a question, right? I'm not a question person. And so I'm not that guy, but I certainly am aware of a few things. So one of the things that the data is not actually in Bokeh, but there is a tutorial that gets the data and uses it. It comes from Gapminder. So Gapminder, first of all, is a really great source, I think, of some data sets with a lot of interesting data about world health and economics and population. But one of our other contributors, the amazing Sarah Bird, who gave an incredible talk at PyCon on Bokeh, recreated Hans Rosling's, sort of the first sort of, famous TED talk. If you remember, it was the sort of stats, he showed, population growth versus, fertility rate. And so, she recreated this chart in Bokeh and just in an IPython notebook, right? And it's just right there, and it's a static document. There's no server required or anything. And so I thought that was really cool. And so there is a tutorial that includes her work to show that, and that's up on the NB Viewer Bokeh. If you go to nbviewer.org, you can see there's a link to the Bokeh NB Viewer page, and we have some tutorial notebooks there, and that's one of the tutorials. And I think that's really good. And just in general, I would say that Gapminder is a great source of data as well. World Bank actually makes a lot of data available. There's certainly a lot of sports fans. A lot of my Twitter feed seems to be people doing a lot of stats on, baseball and basketball. I'm not a big sports fan, so I don't know much about that, but I know a lot of those data sets are at least available, and you can sort of see what people have done. So I wish I had better things to suggest there, but that's sort of things I can toss out off the top of my head.
No, I think that's actually very good. So Gapminder, World Bank, and I'm sorry, there was a sports.
I don't have a good source for that. I just know those data sets are available. So
okay, okay.
I will defer to Google or Alphabet or whatever they're called now to search for that. So I'm trying to think of other things too. I guess Kaggle, there's the Kaggle competition. I'm sure they have some data sets associated with, their competitions, and it'd be interesting to see if someone, tries to do some work or compete on Kaggle, maybe using a Bokeh plot as part of the project. So, that'd be kind of cool. But, I'm sorry, the Million Song data set. That's kind of interesting too. It's kind of a different data set, but I remember using that in a previous sort of project, and I haven't looked at it since, but it occurs to me that there must be a lot of interesting things you could do by, taking a look at the Million Song data set.
Very cool. Thank you.
And there's also data.gov for open government data.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
So can you provide some comparisons between D3.js and the Bokeh JavaScript library in terms of capabilities and performance?
Sure. I'll say what I know. So I actually have not done a lot of D3 programming. I mean, it just hasn't, again, I was not, at least before starting this, much of a JavaScript programmer at all. I was, familiar with the existence of D3. So, I think the standard usage of D3 involves creating a bunch of DOM elements, SVG DOM elements, and that's sort of how it typically works, although there may be some ways to render D3 under the canvas these days as well. But I think that's one of the distinctions is that, Bokeh was written from the ground up, to work on HTML5 canvas and now WebGL canvas. And so I think that gives us the ability to reach into some, I won't say big data sets, but, medium data sets. If you really want to have tens of thousands of points and you have the pixels to spare to show those points, you can do that with Bokeh and you can still maintain interactivity and things like hover tools or, panning and zooming or selections on all of those points. And so I think that's sort of one of the distinctions as well. Obviously, when we talk about integrating the Bokeh server, we're really trying to let people create not just the plot or the visualization, but really sort of maybe a data application might have other widgets that you can use to again, inform further computations. Maybe you select the dropdown and you actually fire off something in a PySpark cluster or something, and then you come back and update your plot. But there's all kinds of things we want to enable. And so I think the architecture of the server is getting to a place where it will enable those sorts of things as well. And actually, another thing that we're working on now is to make the model system extensible. So right now, all the models are sort of baked in. People can't really extend Bokeh very well. And we'd like to make it so that anyone can really create their own Python model with a corresponding JavaScript implementation and then integrate that directly with any Bokeh plot. And I think that allows people to experiment and play around and do whatever they want. If there's some amazing new JavaScript library, of this week that someone wants to wrap and include in a Bokeh plot, they can do it really easily. And that's the place where we want to get to. So we're not quite there yet. It may be a bit easier right now to sort of extend. And I know there's a lot of plugins for D3. So that may be an area where we're playing a little bit of catch up. But so I in terms of like performance, I think definitely, certainly with the server, you get to the area of being able to downsample data sort of much more easily. And I think you extend the reach into sort of larger data sets very easily. And that's maybe the biggest difference I would draw between D3 and Bokeh.
And what about browser compatibility?
Really good question. So this is a hard thing to do. I was listening actually to the podcast a bit earlier about PyTest, because we've just started sort of migrating to PyTest in a very ad hoc, sort of slow, piecemeal fashion from our unit tests. And I noticed at the beginning you mentioned another podcast about testing I may have to start listening to, because especially with browsers, I mean, the matrix just explodes, right? I mean, you think about, well, I want to, we want to maintain compatibility with, Python 2.7 and at one point maybe even 2.6 or 3.3 and 3.4, and then 3.5 is coming out, and then we want to test on all these platforms, and each platform has three browsers, but not just three browsers, three versions of each kind of browser. I mean, you can imagine sort of your test matrix just exploding. And so, right now we do continuous integration testing with like sort of Phantom.js, and we're looking at now integrating Selenium with actual sort of browser, better browser testing in there. So I can't give anything hard and fast on that. I mean, I test typically on Safari. We test on Safari and Chrome and Firefox, Internet Explorer. Off the top of my head, I couldn't give you sort of versions. Obviously, you're going to need a fairly recent version of Internet Explorer to run, but I've been using it on Safari, for instance, for 2 years. So I would imagine if you have OS X from 2 years ago, it should probably work without too much problems. And but it does become definitely a burden, because occasionally there's a problem. It's like, oh, this is a problem on this one specific version of Chrome. And then if you bump, one more, point version, it's not anymore. And I'm like, well, I don't think we just don't have the resources to go back and fix, something on every point version of every browser. But it's interesting to see the dimensions and the scale of that, of that testing problem. And so if there are folks that have a lot of experience doing, again, testing for different browsers and different platforms and want to contribute, by all means, come chat with us, because we can use all the help we can get.
So you've alluded to a server component a couple of times, and I was reading through the documentation and seeing that it allows for streaming data to clients. Can you describe the architecture of that and some example uses for it?
For sure. I'm going to describe the coming architecture, because we're actually taking the lessons that we've learned from the previous year and sort of retooling the server at present. And I'm hoping that's going to, again, land in 0.10. It may be a little bit after that. But the main idea, it was sort of what I mentioned earlier, is that there's basically a mirror. There's a sort of declarative object graph that describes the whole visualization, the widgets, the tools, the plots, the glyphs on the plots, all sorts of things. And that exists in Python on the server as a series of Python objects, this object graph. But there's also now a mirror of that as backbone models in the client. And they're linked such that if if one of them updates, it communicates back to the other. And so if you push data updates to the server, the plot updates, and you'll see the plot update. And so that's one way you can get streaming data. That Ajax data source I mentioned is another way. And so I've shown off at a couple of different conferences a spectrogram example that uses that Ajax data source to get a nice spectrogram rolling from my microphone. But in terms of the server, it's all about, pushing data. So that's sort of a pull model, but the server is more of a push model. If you push data up to the server, the plot will react. But the new architecture, we're trying to pare down and make the server actually much simpler. And so, that's probably the one area where the documentation has faltered a bit. And I think it really goes back to the fact that we weren't sure we had something we wanted to commit to. And the fact that we're changing it now is probably indicative of that. But the main thing the server needs to do is to be this reflective sort of RPC mechanism, right? Where if you have a model in one place, in one language, and it updates, then it'll update in the client and vice versa. And so we're going to make it do that in a spectacular fashion. We're actually going to move to a WebSocket wire protocol for everything. That's going to simplify a lot of things for us. It's going to be a little bit more like the IPython sort of server, if you want to think of our Jupyter server, rather, if you want to think about it in those terms. But when you pair that with the idea of being able to extend the Bokeh model system, which is sort of some other ongoing work at the moment, then again, it becomes really very powerful and sort of a platform for people to do a lot of experimentation and they don't have to be tied to our schedule or tied to to our work. They can integrate their own contributions directly in a very natural way. And so that's where we want to get to. And I think we're a few months away from that. But definitely in terms of applications for that, I mean, you could imagine we live in a world where there's lots of sensors everywhere. And so there's sort of streaming data from all directions, whether that's sort of social media and sentiment channels, whether that's, physical sensors and satellites and climate sensing or any kind of, data that's just coming in a stream. This would allow, visualization of that data in a very sort of an easy way. So that's where we're going. Again, the new servers, I say one of the things is, I think initially we sort of confused some of the things we wanted to be able to do by virtue of having a server with the server, right? So we sort of tried to build in some of this abstract rendering and downsampling into the server and some of these other capabilities. And instead, if we make the server more of this platform, we can build those things on top, and then other people can build things on top too. And I think that's a much better place to be. And so I'm excited we have a much more sort of coherent and clear vision of where to head to. And we have to get there. We're a little ways away.
And I noticed that the server was written as a Flask blueprint, and I'm curious what drove that decision as opposed to making it a component of another framework such as Django or Pyramid, and how difficult it would be to port that functionality to another system, though you mentioned that you're going to a whole new architecture, so I'm curious if you're sticking with Flask.
Yeah, no, we're not. We're gonna find out the answer to that question very very short order. Have started down that road. The reason is actually just boils down to at least at Continuum we have a lot of institutional knowledge around Flask, and that was sort of the first natural thing to reach to. Definitely Django is certainly a great platform for web apps, and certainly Pyramid seems pretty interesting too from the little experience that I have with it. But the new server is actually going to be a pure Tornado app. Again, I mentioned we're going to go to a WebSocket wire protocol, and so we want the asynchronous capability. And actually Tornado just seems like it's easier to deploy. If we have sessions attached to WebSockets, we don't have to, we can have local in-memory caches that don't have to sort of communicate between different instances of the server that might be running. And so we can just run more of them. And it's, was attached to some Redis backend. And it's a much more simpler sort of diagram when you start drawing out the components than what we had. And so that's just, there's not going to be any more Flask. It's just going to be a Tornado app. Again, very much like the Jupyter IPython server.
So what's the most interesting use of Bokeh you've seen?
Also, really great question. So, as I mentioned, one of the challenges with an open source project is that people come to you when there's problems, which is great, or when there's features that they that aren't there yet that they want. And so we see a lot of that. And when things are working, they don't necessarily come and knock on your door and tell you about it. They just use it. And so it's definitely been my experience that at conferences now quite a few times where people have been like, oh yeah, of course I use Bokeh. I do this really cool thing with it. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. I'd love to know what it is, or can you show it to me? Like, no, I can't show it to you. It's our corporate network. I can't show it to you. It's sort of this proprietary thing. And so I haven't gotten to see as much of that as I'd want to. I actually really am interested in building up like a user, user success stories or, user gallery of things that people have built. But that said, things do come across our attention from time to time on Twitter. Or talking to people at conferences we've seen. So certainly there was someone recently on Twitter who I think was analyzing phylogenetic data, and they made this really interesting sort of radial visualization with, a hover tool that could drill down into the different details depending on where you are hovering around this sort of phylogenetic tree. Recently I mentioned the sprint that I did at PyData Seattle. This astronomer, again, was doing really cool things with, I think it was like 4,000 or 5,000 galaxy data points, and it was a sort of very dense visualization, but he was doing some interesting smoothing over it. But then you could drill down again as you hovered over it. You got this sidebar with all kinds of interesting detail about things. More interestingly, I've heard of people again putting actual images in the hover tool. I hadn't even thought about that, but of course it seems perfectly reasonable thing to do once someone says, hey, I've done this. I've hovered over a data point and I fetched some image from my database and I'm actually displaying like a microscopy. It was a microscopy image associated with whatever data point they were hovering over. So again, I'm always amazed by all the cool things that users come up with to do, and I would love to hear more of those things. So if people are working on things and it's something they can share publicly, please, by all means, tweet at us or come to the mailing list. And we just opened up a new Bokeh-demos repo on GitHub under the Bokeh organization. I'd love to start adding. If anyone wants to contribute anything there, we'll take just about anything to put in there to show off Bokeh. And really, again, I'd love to have sort of a success stories or case studies, kind of a site that we can stand up in the next few months or 6 months. That really shows, real world sort of usage of Bokeh. And so, but some of the ones that come to the top of my head are the ones, I guess, that I mentioned. We see a lot of interesting folks from academia using Bokeh, but certainly a lot of data scientists as well.
And are you aware of any projects in other languages that are comparable to Bokeh?
Yeah, there's a ton of interest in this space. There's no shortage of all kinds of projects, really, you could rattle off. I mean, there's certainly other projects in Python to begin with. I mean, there's of course, Matplotlib and all the tools that are, based around that. There's, Pixley, I think, was just announced, another project for sort of Python-based sort of dashboards and interactive tools. Of course, Plotly is another, they're a commercial endeavor, and they're sort of similar to Bokeh, and they have multiple language bindings, and they have... They actually got to a MATLAB binding. I always joked that I was going to make a MATLAB binding for Bokeh because I used to do MATLAB programming in a former lifetime. But they got to that first for Plotly. And then, but that's in sort of the Python space, but there's lots of other things as well. Obviously, in the R world, there's ggplot and upcoming ggviz and, of course, D3 and JavaScript. And there's other JavaScript libraries for things like GIS, like, I think leaflet.js is a really great library. And, if you need to do tiling, there's open layers. We're going to try to do an open layers integration into Bokeh as well. There's a lot of different specialties and subdomains. Thinking broader, I actually used to use Mathematica a lot, and I always thought Mathematica's sort of plotting and viz capabilities were pretty interesting and compelling. Even back when I was doing it a lot, and I don't do it so much anymore. But I've seen it lately, and I'm like, yeah, it's pretty impressive. They've got a really nice system for sort of interactive, being able to attach sort of widgets to data and plot elements to data and they've got some impressive stuff going on there as well. So there's a lot of interest, and of course MATLAB is certainly still in heavy use itself. So there's just a ton of tools. I think they're actually getting into the game of doing some web-enabled plots for MATLAB. I think I remember reading something about that recently. So a lot of interest in this space. I think a lot of people realize that it's again 2015, and really publishing things means putting them into the client and the browser and making them accessible and easily sort of viewable and easy for people to play around with. And so we're not the only people to realize that, I guess is what I would say. But, those are some other projects that come to mind, and I'm sure I've forgotten quite a few as well. C++, right? I mean, there's people still use root. If you go to the physics community, I went to grad school for physics, and so I saw people using root for plotting all the time, and it's kind of obscure. But on the other hand, there are all these things that exist in these niches. I mentioned astronomers earlier. Astronomers still use IDL quite extensively for data analysis and visualization. I think there's sort of a younger vanguard of astronomers coming up that are trying to carry the flag of Python, and I'm happy to see that. But yeah, there's all these different domains, and so it really depends on what you're trying to do. But anyway, that's a quick summary from my memory.
So before we move to the picks, are there any questions that we didn't ask that you think we should have, or anything that you wanted to bring up?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I had seen that one coming. No, not off the top of my head. I mean, I'm really excited, like I said, to be a part of this team, and I'm really grateful that Continuum has the ability to support this effort. But Bokeh is an open source project, and we have gotten contributors from outside, and we're always looking for more. So if you're interested in data visualization, if you're interested in helping out with Bokeh or RBokeh or Bokeh.Scala or any of these projects, or the JavaScript bindings, it's a big project with a basically semi-unbounded to-do list, and so we'll take help anywhere we can get. So definitely I would appeal to anyone who has interest in helping us show off Bokeh to come show us what you're doing, or even just come pitch in with actual development. That'd be great as well too. So.
Well, with that, we'll move to the picks. So for my first pick, I'm going to choose The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. It's a young adult novel about a young boy who gets raised in a graveyard by all of its inhabitants. And it's a quick read. It's a fun read. So I definitely recommend checking that out, particularly if you have kids who are in the 8 to 14 range. I think they would really get a kick out of it, and even any adult. My next pick is a Chrome plugin called Wappalizer, and what it is it just will show an icon in the URL bar whenever you visit a page that will, if you click on it, it will give you a drop down of all the different tech stack that it detects as it's loading the page. So it's an interesting way of seeing what different sites are using under the covers, and maybe learning about a couple new libraries that you haven't heard of before. And for my last pick, I'm going to choose a project called Magarena. It's a Magic the Gathering open source one-player game where you can play Magic against an AI, and it has all the cards from inception, from its creation all the way up to modern day, and it's just a fun way to play around with that without necessarily having to go out and spend a fortune on the cards. And I'll leave it at that for this time around. So Chris, what have you got?
So my first pick is an article that just went by my feed today, actually. I guess this year, just not too long ago, there was a meeting of the IETF in Portugal where they screened the Edward Snowden movie Citizen 4. And after that, that movie, they actually managed to get Edward Snowden on the line on Skype for an hour so they could do a question and answer period. So essentially, you had all the people who drive all the tech working groups that, basically make the internet go, having an opportunity to grill Edward Snowden on his thoughts on, the security of the internet and how protocols should evolve. It's really, really a fascinating read. It definitely, whatever you may say about him, you cannot say that he is not a thoughtful person. It's definitely worth taking a look at. My next pick is a lot less obscure. This book has gotten a lot of press lately, but I don't care. I'm going to pick it anyway because it's absolutely phenomenal. It's called Between the World and Me. And I should have the full name of the author. I believe it's Tenniel Coates. It is basically a letter written by this man to his 15-year-old son, trying to help him better make his way through the world as a person growing up black in America. And I read this book on the recommendation of a relative whose opinion I respect. And I kind of was half expecting to see a kind of a diatribe on racial justice or injustice in America. And that's not what I saw at all. It is a beautifully written, compassionate, relatively subjective analysis of some of the really sort of like aspects of our society that we, especially those of us who are white, middle class, happy Americans would much rather brush under the rug and forget and never have to see. It's well worth a read, and it's more than you think it will be. I will just say that. You will get more out of it than you think you might based on my description. So definitely check it out. And my last pick is a service with accompanying smartphone app that many people have heard of, but I still think it's worth giving them some kudos. Untapped. UNTAPP''D. And so basically this thing, their tagline is drink socially, but it actually ties into this episode in the sense that, so, you're out somewhere and you get a beer that you like and you can check it in with this app. And that's great. And so, there's all the usual things like you can broadcast it to social media and the like, and, earn badges for unlocking different combinations of things. But what's really great is now they've added an option that for like $20 a year or something like that, you can become a supporting member, which gives you the opportunity to export all of your data in a number of different formats. And so what has been really cool about this for me is I essentially have an effortless catalog of all the beers that I've liked and disliked over the course of the year. You can export it in XML or JSON, and there's a couple of other for Excel, I think. And so I've just kind of been playing with that. I have not succeeded yet in generating a readable bokeh graph with that data, but I can definitely see a blog post in my future playing with that kind of stuff. It's actually a really great, well-designed service that actually provides a lot of utility more than just sort of doing the usual pointless social media stuff. So that's it for me. Brian, what do you have for us?
Yeah, sure. Push, that's awesome. I look forward to the tweet at Bokeh Plots to see the wonderful visualization of that. So for my first pick, I'm going to stick with sort of an abstract concept of audiobooks. So I just recently had a friend introduce me to audiobooks. I'd been meaning to try to get more reading and more fiction into my life, and I never knew where to start because there's just an ocean of it, and what do you start with? And so she's given me a lot of great recommendations, and audiobooks are a great way to consume things. So I've really enjoyed that, and there's a lot of different services I'm sure you can use to get those, and they've just been a real addition to my life that I've enjoyed. But switching gears, I would recommend now also something that's a little bit more concrete and also of the dead tree variety, perhaps. A really nice book that I just got sort of pointed in my direction recently, which was called Cartographies of Time, History of the Timeline. And so I'm interested in general about books about visualization and Playfair and Bertin and the Grammar of Graphics by Wilkinson. But this is a book really all about sort of time time series data and how has that been presented sort of from its earliest inceptions and up through sort of modern ideas of presenting time series data. And so it's really beautifully visually illustrated. And so I definitely recommend that to anyone. And then the last pick is a musical group. I recently had the fortune, someone got me tickets to go see. It was the Postmodern Jukebox. So this is sort of rotating group of musicians out of New York and Brooklyn, and they do sort of genre-bending covers of modern pop songs, but in all kinds of old genres. And the concert was pure joy. It was a really great concert. But they have a lot of videos on YouTube. You can catch all their stuff. And so I definitely would recommend anyone to check that out as well.
Very cool. Cartographies of Time definitely sounds like a good sort of like definitely buy it in paper, even for those of us who are addicted to the ebook format kind of thing.
Well, that's great. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us and tell us all about Bokeh and all the various things that are being done around it. So for anybody who wants to keep in touch with you and follow what you're up to and what Continuum is doing with Bokeh, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, great. No, so first, thank you guys for having me. I love to sort of talk about and tell people about Bokeh. It's I think it's really cool, and so I love telling people about it and talking about it, and hope they think it's cool too. But we have a mailing list, Google Groups. It's recently been mirrored on that other news aggregator. I can't remember. But yeah, Google Group mailing list is a great way for technical questions. All of this information is on bokeh.pydata.org, by the way, is the main documentation and site for Bokeh. So you can get to the Bokeh GitHub, you can get to the Bokeh mailing list. Our Twitter is at BokehPlots, BOKEHPLOTS. There's another great way to sort of get a hold of us. And of course, we try to monitor Stack Overflow and things like that for questions. But all those other places are really good places to sort of come holler at us and come get engaged in a conversation.
Well, I'm sure our audience is going to enjoy listening to this. There's a lot of really good information. And again, we appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you and good night.